August 15th, 1945. Okinawa, Japan. Colonel Hiromichi Yahara stood in the ruins of what had been the 32nd Army headquarters, deep inside Shuri Castle's underground tunnels. Around him, the last 47 survivors of a command that once numbered 110,000 men waited for orders. Japan had surrendered. The Emperor himself had announced it via radio. The war was over. But Colonel Yahara, the senior surviving officer of Japanese forces on Okinawa, faced an impossible decision. Had sent surrender terms. The terms were standard: immediate cessation of hostilities, surrender of all weapons, and assembly at designated points for processing as prisoners of war. But the terms made no mention of the thousands of Japanese dead still lying unburied across Okinawa's battlefield, bodies that had been exposed to elements for weeks or months, denied proper burial because combat had never stopped long enough to recover them. Japanese military culture, deeply influenced by Shinto religious beliefs, held that proper burial of the dead was a sacred duty. Warriors who died for the emperor deserved cremation or burial with appropriate ceremonies honoring their sacrifice. Leaving bodies unburied was considered profoundly disrespectful, and it meant the spirits of the dead couldn't find peace. For Colonel Yahara, the idea of surrendering while thousands of his men lay unburied felt like betraying everyone who had died under his command. "I cannot surrender until my men are properly buried," Yahara told his staff officers. "It would be dishonorable to their memory and to their families." What Colonel Yahara didn't know, what he couldn't have anticipated, was that the American general receiving his refusal would not only understand his concerns, but would make an unprecedented decision that would shock both Japanese and American forces. Suspend all operations, grant the Japanese 3 full days to recover and bury their dead with full military honors, and only then accept their surrender. This act of respect toward a defeated enemy, this willingness to delay final victory to honor Japanese cultural values, would become one of the most remarkable demonstrations of military courtesy in World War II and would profoundly affect post-war Japanese attitudes toward American occupation. To understand why this decision was so extraordinary, we must first examine the state of Japanese-American combat on Okinawa, the cultural significance of proper burial in Japanese military tradition, and the unprecedented nature of allowing defeated enemies time to honor their dead before accepting their surrender. The Battle of Okinawa had been the bloodiest campaign of the Pacific War. Fighting lasted 82 days, from April to June 1945. Japanese forces, outnumbered and outgunned, fought with suicidal determination, knowing that Okinawa was Japan's last defensive line before the home islands. The 32nd Army defended every ridge, every cave, every position until completely destroyed. When positions became untenable, Japanese soldiers launched banzai charges or committed suicide rather than surrendering. American casualties were catastrophic by Pacific War standards: 12,500 killed, 38,000 wounded, 26,000 non-battle casualties, including combat fatigue and disease. But Japanese casualties dwarfed even these terrible numbers. Approximately 110,000 Japanese soldiers killed, along with perhaps 100,000 Okinawan civilians caught in the fighting. The island became a graveyard where the dead outnumbered the living and where proper burial had been impossible during active combat. Japanese military culture treated death in battle as the highest honor. Soldiers were expected to fight to the death rather than surrender. The concept of gyokusai, shattering like a jewel, meant dying beautifully for the emperor through brave combat death rather than suffering the shame of capture. But this cultural emphasis on honorable death created corresponding obligations to honor those who died. Bodies of fallen soldiers were to be cremated when possible, with ashes returned to families. When cremation wasn't possible, burial with appropriate ceremonies showing respect for the sacrifice was required. The reality of Okinawa's battlefield made proper burial impossible during combat. Bodies lay where they fell, in caves, on ridges, in fields, along roads. Some had been there for weeks, decomposing under tropical sun. The dead included not just combat casualties, but also soldiers who committed suicide when positions were overrun, and officers who performed seppuku ritual suicide rather than facing capture. Recovering and burying these remains would require extensive time and labor that combat operations never allowed. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, Colonel Yahara became the senior surviving Japanese officer on Okinawa. General Ushijima, the 32nd Army commander, had committed suicide on June 22 as American forces overran the final defensive positions. Colonel Yahara had survived only because General Ushijima specifically ordered him to live and bear witness to the 32nd Army's sacrifice. Now Yahara faced the responsibility of surrendering the remnants of Japanese forces while knowing that thousands of his comrades lay unburied. Yahara's initial refusal to surrender immediately was transmitted through intermediaries to the American 10th Army headquarters. The message explained that Japanese forces would comply with surrender terms but requested time to recover and bury the dead before formal surrender occurred. The message was carefully worded to avoid sounding like a rejection of surrender, but it clearly stated that burial of the dead must precede any other action. American staff officers who received this message were uncertain how to respond. Standard military procedure was to accept surrender immediately, disarm enemy forces, and then handle burial of the dead as a logistical cleanup operation performed by prisoners under American supervision. Allowing enemy forces to remain armed and autonomous while conducting burial operations seemed to violate established procedures and potentially created security risks. But Lieutenant General Simon Buckner, the 10th Army commander, understood that this situation required flexibility and cultural sensitivity, rather than rigid adherence to standard procedures. Buckner, who would actually die before the battle's official end, had been replaced by General Roy Geiger, who now faced this decision. But Buckner's staff officers remembered his emphasis on respecting enemy courage and treating defeated enemies with dignity consistent with military honor. General Joseph Stilwell, who had assumed command of the 10th Army after Geiger's brief tenure, made the final decision after consulting with his staff and with Marine General Oliver P. Smith, whose forces had fought extensively on Okinawa and who understood Japanese military culture better than most American commanders. Stilwell's decision was unprecedented. Grant Colonel Yahara's request, suspend all American military operations in the relevant sectors, allow Japanese forces to recover and bury their dead for 3 days, and only then proceed with formal surrender. 3 days, Stilwell's response stated. You may have 3 days to recover and bury your dead with appropriate military honors. American forces will not interfere. We will provide you with burial supplies, including shovels, body bags, and materials for funeral pyres if cremation is preferred. After 3 days, we expect full compliance with surrender terms. When Colonel Yahara received this response, he read it 3 times, unable to believe what it said. He called his surviving staff officers together and read it aloud in case he was misunderstanding somehow. The Americans were granting them 3 days to bury the dead. They were providing supplies to help. They were suspending operations to allow this to happen. It seemed impossible, inconsistent with everything Japanese propaganda had said about American cruelty and dishonor. One officer asked. It appears genuine, Yahara responded. They are showing respect for our dead and for our duty to bury them. This is... Over the next 3 days, Japanese survivors conducted one of the most emotionally wrenching operations of the war, recovering and burying thousands of their dead comrades. American forces maintained security perimeters, but didn't interfere. They watched as Japanese soldiers, many weeping openly, recovered bodies from caves and fields, performed Buddhist and Shinto ceremonies, and buried or cremated remains with military honors. American supply officers delivered the promised burial materials, shovels, body bags, wood for funeral pyres, lime for graves. Some American units went further, providing water, food, and medical supplies for the Japanese burial parties who were working in intense heat and emotionally devastated by the grim task. A few American chaplains attended some of the ceremonies, showing respect through their presence, even though language barriers prevented direct participation. The burial operations were heartbreaking for the Japanese survivors. Many found friends, brothers, former students or teachers among the dead. Some found commanding officers who had ordered them to survive and bear witness, now dead themselves and needing burial. The work was physically exhausting and emotionally traumatic, but every Japanese participant felt profound relief that this duty could be fulfilled. American soldiers watching from security positions were moved by what they witnessed. These were enemies who had fought with suicidal ferocity just days earlier, who had killed thousands of American soldiers, who had refused to surrender even when defeat was certain. Now they wept over their dead and buried them with ceremonies that showed deep reverence and grief. The humanity was obvious and powerful, reminding American troops that enemies were human beings with cultures, values and emotions similar to their own. On the evening of the third day, Colonel Yahara sent a message to American headquarters. "The dead are buried. We are ready to comply with surrender terms. We thank you for permitting us to honor our fallen comrades." The formal surrender occurred the following morning. Colonel Yahara and his surviving officers and men assembled at the designated point. They surrendered their weapons, formed ranks, and marched into American custody with military bearing and dignity. American guards treated them respectfully, following orders to handle the surrender with courtesy appropriate to defeated soldiers who had fought bravely and who had been granted extraordinary consideration regarding their cultural obligations. The impact of this decision extended far beyond the immediate surrender. News of the American gesture spread through Japanese POW camps across the Pacific. Japanese prisoners who had expected harsh treatment or execution instead heard that Americans had delayed victory to allow burial of enemy dead. The propaganda image of Americans as cruel and dishonorable barbarians collapsed in the face of this evidence of respect and cultural sensitivity. Post-war Japanese historians and military officers who wrote about Okinawa consistently cited this incident as evidence that American forces, despite the brutality of the combat, maintained honor and respect toward defeated enemies. Colonel Yahara himself, who survived the war and wrote extensively about the Okinawa campaign, always mentioned the 3-day burial period as the moment when he understood that American forces were not the monsters Japanese propaganda had portrayed. In his post-war memoir, Yahara wrote, "When General Stilwell granted us 3 days to bury our dead, he showed understanding of what mattered most to Japanese soldiers. We had failed to defend Okinawa. We had lost everything, but we could still honor those who died. The Americans understood this and respected it. That respect did more to demonstrate American civilization and honor than any propaganda could have achieved." The decision's impact on American-Japanese relations during occupation was significant. Japanese civilians on Okinawa witnessed American forces suspending operations to allow proper burial of enemy dead. This contradicted everything Japanese civilians had been told about American cruelty. When American occupation forces arrived in Japan proper, Okinawan refugees who had witnessed or heard about this gesture helped spread understanding that Americans could be trusted to treat Japanese people with dignity. The military-cultural exchange that resulted from this gesture influenced how American forces approached occupation duties. American commanders realized that showing respect for Japanese cultural values, even when those values seemed foreign or unnecessary to Americans, could build cooperation and reduce resistance far more effectively than imposing American values through force. The 3-day burial period cost American forces nothing of military significance. The war was over. Japan had surrendered, allowing defeated Japanese forces to bury their dead delayed final cleanup operations by 3 days, but affected no military objectives. Yet the gesture had profound psychological and cultural impact worth far more than the minimal cost. Other instances of American cultural sensitivity toward Japanese burial customs occurred throughout the Pacific Theater during and after the war. American forces generally allowed captured Japanese forces to cremate or bury their dead, according to Japanese religious customs. American graves registration units, when processing battlefield remains, treated Japanese dead with the same respectful procedures used for American casualties, recording identities when possible and marking graves to allow later repatriation of remains to Japan. This contrasted sharply with Japanese treatment of Allied dead in areas under Japanese control, where bodies were often left unburied or buried in unmarked mass graves. Japanese forces generally didn't deliberately desecrate enemy dead, but they also didn't expend resources to provide proper burial for prisoners who died in captivity or for enemy casualties found on battlefields. The difference reflected different cultural priorities rather than deliberate cruelty, but the contrast was noted by survivors of both sides. The post-war return of Japanese remains from Pacific battlefields became a significant reconciliation issue. American forces had buried thousands of Japanese soldiers in marked graves, recording identities and locations. When Japan requested repatriation of remains beginning in the 1950s, American authorities cooperated fully, providing records and assisting with exhumation and return of remains to Japan. This cooperation, which built on the respect shown during wartime burial operations, helped heal wartime bitterness and contributed to the strong alliance that developed between former enemies. Colonel Yahara's post-war life reflected his gratitude for the respect shown during the burial period. He worked with American occupation authorities in several capacities, serving as a consultant on Japanese military culture and helping translate captured Japanese documents. He maintained correspondence with several American officers who had served on Okinawa, including some who had provided burial supplies during the 3-day period. In 1970, at the 25th anniversary commemoration of the Battle of Okinawa, Yahara met with American veterans at a ceremony honoring both American and Japanese dead. He spoke about the burial period and its impact on his understanding of American values. "I expected you to be barbarous conquerors. Instead, you showed that you understood what honor meant to us. You allowed us to bury our dead properly before accepting our surrender. This small gesture demonstrated that you fought us as enemies, but respected us as soldiers." The ceremony included a moment of silence for all who died on Okinawa, followed by remarks from both American and Japanese veterans about reconciliation and the transformation of former enemies into allies and friends. The shared understanding that burial of the dead was a universal human need, transcending nationality and culture, provided common ground for former enemies to build friendship. Modern American military cultural training uses the Okinawa burial period as a case study in showing respect for enemy cultures and values. Military officers studying the Pacific War learn that respecting enemy cultural practices, when possible without compromising military objectives, can build cooperation and reduce resistance more effectively than imposing American values through force. The lesson extended beyond military applications to broader American foreign policy. Understanding and respecting foreign cultural values, even when those values seem strange to Americans, can build relationships and achieve objectives that force or cultural imperialism cannot. The 3 days granted to Colonel Yahara and his soldiers cost America nothing but generated goodwill that lasted decades. Today, memorials on Okinawa honor both American and Japanese dead. The Peace Memorial Park includes sections for Japanese military dead, Okinawan civilian dead, and Allied military dead, reflecting the universal tragedy of war and the importance of honoring all who died. American and Japanese officials regularly participate in joint ceremonies, demonstrating the transformation from enemies to allies. Colonel Yahara died in 1981 at age 87. At his funeral, several American veterans who had served on Okinawa attended, honoring a former enemy who had become a friend and who had helped bridge the gap between former enemies. His family received condolence messages from American military officers and veterans organizations, acknowledging his role in building mutual understanding between Americans and Japanese. The story of Colonel Yahara's refusal to surrender until his men were buried, and General Stilwell's decision to grant 3 days for burial operations, demonstrates that warfare doesn't eliminate humanity, and that respect for enemy cultural values can transform hatred into friendship. The Americans who granted this request understood that defeating Japan didn't require destroying Japanese culture or dishonoring Japanese military traditions. Victory could be achieved while still respecting the values that made enemies fight with such determination. The 3 days granted to bury the dead represented American values at their best: strength tempered by mercy, victory achieved without humiliation of the defeated, and respect for enemy humanity even in the midst of brutal warfare. These values, demonstrated through small gestures like allowing burial of the dead before accepting surrender, proved more powerful than any weapon in transforming former enemies into lasting friends and allies. When Colonel Yahara surrendered after burying his men, he surrendered to an enemy who had shown that American concepts of honor and respect could accommodate Japanese cultural values without requiring Japanese to abandon what mattered most to them. That accommodation, that respect, that small gesture of granting 3 days to bury the dead represented the foundation upon which post-war Japanese-American friendship was built. And decades later, when American and Japanese veterans stood together at memorials honoring all who died on Okinawa, they stood on ground that had been consecrated not just by the blood of war, but by the respect shown to the dead of both sides, making possible the friendship that replaced enmity.